Αγαπητές φίλες και αγαπητοί φίλοι, να σας καλησπερίσω και να σας καλωσορίσω στην απόψινή παρουσίαση του νέου βιβλίου του καθηγητή του Τμήματος Κοινωνικών Επιστημών, δόκτωρα Νίκου Τριμικλινιώτη, με τίτλο Migration and Refugee Dissensus in Europe Borders, Security and Austerity. According to the event's first announcement and the information found on the invitation and on the University of Nicosia website, a welcome was to be delivered by Professor Constantinou, our University Vice Rector for Faculty and Research. Obviously, I'm not Professor Felas. My name is Klimis Mastoridis. My field is the history of Greek printing and the theory of typography, and I'm here today as the Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, to which Professor Trimikliniotis belongs. Please allow me to welcome the esteemed panel of experts, Professors Floya, Anthias, Sitas, and Costas Constantinou, who will talk about the book, and to thank you all for honoring us with your presence this evening. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Here are people vastly more knowledgeable than I am to talk and discuss about Nicos' book, migration, refugee and asylum issues he's addressing and the framework he's proposing. I come from a country that went through a compulsory population exchange, a transfer forced migration of almost 2 million people in the 1920s. A country where not only meets historiography, but in everyday life discussions and the words or concepts, if you like, of αποδημία, παροικία, migration, διασπορά, ομογένεια των Ελλήνων οι κοινότητες, Greek communities abroad, think of Ioannis Savopoulos, not to mention Kazatsidis. So in music too, keep coming up, but also a country which, amidst the most severe and prolonged debt crisis since World War II, struggles to deal with the steadily increasing numbers of refugees and asylum seekers, as well as the consequences of the inadequate global response. Many things could be said about the crime that's being committed in Moria, with the responsibility of the Brussels authorities, the EU authorities, and the Greek governments. The case of Moria, also discussed in Nicos' book, with all the known and unknown dramatically negative effects on people at the migrant camp and the local community, should have been more than enough to convince us that this is not a policy management issue, a policy management matter. Refugee crisis, mass population movements, immigration and asylum issues in a world of constant flux need a different approach, clear thinking towards the development of new tools, ideas that will help us examine, understand complexities and act accordingly. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Trimikliniotis for having offered me the chance to participate in today's event and congratulate him on the publication of his book. Νίκο, να ευχηθώ καλό τάξιδο, ήδη άρχισαν οι πωλήσεις από ό,τι είδα. Many thanks to the three main speakers for being here with us, and a big thank you to you all. I'm sure we will all enjoy this excellent food for thought opportunity. Thank you. Nicos asked me to do the coordination. Obviously, I would start talking about typography, so I thought that Professor Constantinou would be best choice to do the coordination, the discussion. Yeah. Δεν σας ενημέρωσε. Okay, all right. Right. Yeah.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here today to talk around some of the issues that Nicos raises, very important issues in modern society. And I'm going to make reference, obviously, to his book as well, but I want to start by kind of just talking a little bit about the kind of moments that we're living in today, which relates to the migration dissensus. In Nicos's book, dissensus is a very key notion, and he draws on the work of a number of thinkers, particularly the work of Rancière, but he inverts Rancière's position in as much as Nicos's argument is that what underlies modern society, and particularly the phenomenon of migration, is conflict and dissensus. This is the normal state of the social. So whereas for Rancière, the ordering and normalizing process is key, and dissensus is something abnormal and unusual, for Nicos, if I'm right, Nicos, the way I understand it, is the opposite, conflict and dissensus. And this, to me, brings to mind very, very much a kind of conflict sociology, particularly drawing from the work of Marx, although in Nicos's book he doesn't actually develop fully the Marxist paradigm that he draws on, because he refers much more to more recent kind of approaches. I see it very much located in that paradigm. And I'll say a little bit more about Nicos's book in a minute, but I want to reflect a little bit on the moment we live in. And I think, as Nicos quite rightly says in this book, we live in a very contradictory moment. And in fact, it's a tautology, I think, to say that we live in unsettling times. Life has been unsettling for many people all over the world throughout time. Poverty, inequality, hatred, collective violence, war, and allegiances of religion, race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality and class have characterized human societies in different ways and within different cultural, political and economic systems since time immemorial. Exploitation, subordination, exclusion and expulsions have been rife through history. It is a figment to think of these as modern or recent phenomena. Agamben's characterization of refugees as bare life could be marshalled to explain many manifestations through history where people become reduced to nature, to zoe as opposed to vios, without political rights and deprived of that which in some views constitutes the human beyond the animal. Whilst Agamben's view is compelling and important, it's also central to reinsert the role of the agonistic and the agentic in human life as that which resists, contests, and is engaged in struggle against the givenness of the social order, the doxa, that often underpin such forms of violence. It's important not to make a strong exceptionalism for modern times in this regard, nor risk a Eurocentric and Westocentric approach that ignores the upheavals, movements and violence produced by the footprints, wounds and foul debris of imperial forms of domination, sometimes referred to as post-coloniality or as limited decolonisation. These still have a dynamic presence, of course, today, not just as vestiges of the past scattered along our way, nor should we ignore conflicts over resources, the control over people's minds and the disciplining of their bodies. The issue of the specificities of the current moment is complex. What we do have is a greater technological apparatus for the exercise of power, a particular critical stage in Western capitalism with the crisis of Western hegemony and power, and a greater capacity of people to exercise their autonomy, for example, with the autonomy of migration, enabling them, on the one hand, to escape conditions which are unlivable, and on the other hand, bringing to the fore the greater means to police these movements by the state in terms of different economic and political projects. There is a global division in what Stuart Hall famously called the West and the Rest, with more than half the world's population living in poverty and disease. Large numbers of people have faced displacement through wars and conflict, as well as poverty, escaping in various ways to seek safer spaces, sometimes to face death of further violations and dehumanization. Many of the world's refugees sit their time out in encampments, waiting to be ordered and sorted. Some find themselves facing life or death situations, risking their lives on boats, interned, for example, in the unfortunately named Calais jungle, which is now closed, and in the disgusting and inhuman febrile environments that refugees face in Libya and elsewhere, and the mass exodus of people from Venezuela. These conditions are overlaid by gendered violence, with many women being raped in the camps and with the effects of racialization and class dividing people. Some form enterprises, dance and sing, and find new forms of sociology and comradeship. Some find ways of evading border controls and enter through the porous borders of the Mediterranean or the Balkans, working in vulnerable and low-paid jobs. Illegal migrants who states turn a blind eye to in the exercise of exploitation. They are not mere victims of structures or mere objects of biopolitics. They are never merely reduced to bare life, even if they sit in no man's land in the buffer zones of life itself. Others can cross state borders more easily through their ability to acquire visas or nationality, with many countries conferring citizenship to those who can pay. The particularity of the present moment, I believe, lies in the contradictory processes of dismantling fixities on the one hand, and tendencies towards their retrenchment and reproduction on the other. This is a mechanism for dealing, I think, with crises at different levels, denoting a central bifurcation in modern societies. The fluidities, in other words, and the fixities, and it's something that Nicos also alludes to when he talks about dissensus, the ordering and deordering process. This play between fluidity, allowing fluidities, allowing change, making concessions, class concessions or concessions to people to cross borders, and on the other hand, the retrenchment of the fixities, returning back, not in the same way, obviously, but through changing ways of fixing populations and reordering them, is part of the way capitalism, modern capitalism, manages its crises at different points in history. We can point, therefore, to the mutual coexistence and codependency between the two poles involved. This is expressed particularly around the boundaries of categorizations. And it's not just categorizations, I think, of migration or ethnicity or race that are at play, but all kinds of categorizations, including gender categorizations and class processes, and the concrete relations involved. So that this is an intersectional process. In other words, when we look at the growth of fluidities on the one hand and the retrenchment of fixities, we see that they're quite complex and interrelated across dimensions and categorizations and inequalities, to do with gender, class, race, ethnicity, and a number of others. Some of these fluidities and fixities are expressed in the making of new spaces of vulnerability, inequality, and degradation found in the present refugee crisis and the growing forms of precarity. Others are manifested in new political spaces of right-wing populisms, another theme that is very strong in Nicos' book about the growth of populism and the growth of alt-right parties. At the same time, there are new spaces of solidarity. And this is the point that Nicos wants to stress, that the present moment, with its contradictory tendencies, gives rise potentially to spaces for new solidarities and new struggles. And in the book, like in a previous book that he co-authored with a number of other writers, he focuses very much on the migrant commons as a mode for transformation, as a new form of solidarity,
which has class articulations within it, but can transcend some of the limitations in the present time of class politics. So that these new spaces of solidarity exist despite the problems that arise through the crises of governance and the crisis of governmentality linked to increasing forms of technologies of bordering and containment and threats to civility and democracy. And there are large pockets of people throughout the world, of active citizens and non-citizens. There are mobilizations against war and inequality, around ecology and climate change, support for refugees and migrants, struggles against violations of rights and around social justice found in grassroots organising, and the re-energisation of anti-racism through the Black Lives Matter movement, despite its retention of identity politics. They're making a difference, for example, in the multiple resistances of migrants and migrant women. And of course, I'm glad to say that Nicos does talk somewhat about migrant women, and he does actually refer to gender, race, ethnicity and class at various points in his book, although presumably for reasons of lack of space he doesn't develop this as much perhaps as some of us would like. So this view of the present moment holding within it a potential for new forms of solidarity, the gaps that appear in the space between the ordering process of society, keeping things fixed, keeping the Westphalian order, Western Westphalian order in place, and the contradictory elements through movements and flows and fluidities gives rise to these new spaces of engagement and solidarity. Perhaps there might be a space in the discussion to talk about what those new spaces of solidarity actually are at the current moment. So, how long have I got? Am I still okay? Another 5 minutes, okay. So, despite the other thing I want to say, well, I've got a slightly longer piece than perhaps I've got time for, is that despite the shift towards greater fluidities and the retrenchment of fixities, the flow, the ebb and flow of these processes, what we haven't seen is a dismantling of inequality regimes, so that although categorizations and borders might open up periodically and then close up, what isn't opening up is the sphere of equality making. And this, I think, relates to the projects, of course, of modern capitalist states, with all their complexities and non-monolithic nature, the projects of unequal distribution of resources, and the concern to maintain this unequal distribution of resources in a world where Western hegemony at the level of particularly of the economic as well as the political is disintegrating, and so Western societies are facing a crisis in this regard. So there may appear gaps, policies which try and address equality issues, but we find them fundamentally flawed. And when we look at empirical evidence, we find that inequality is still very rife, not only globally in the world, between nations and states, but also within nations and states. In countries like Britain, America, we find that inequalities on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, and of course on the basis of class are still important. One of the interesting things, of course, is that with gender and race, there have been attempts to deal with inequalities through systems of equal pay and laws against discrimination, and so on, which have not been successful for a number of reasons, which is too complex to go into now. But in the case of class, those policies are not in place. And this is because class as a category is itself completely undergirded by the existence of inequality. So it's taken for granted that class means inequality, whereas with gender and race there have been attempts, as I say, to try and correct some of the inequalities involved. And what is particularly disturbing in the case of with migration is the growth of anti-migration discourse, which Nicos in his book goes into in some detail, and the growth of different forms of racism. And there has been, of course, a debate about the extent to which anti-migration discourse is racist. And I, you know, in the work that I've done, I've argued that racism is a question of effects, and it's a question of, you know, how people are placed in society, their social location, rather than a question of the specific form of ideology. Because racism is opportunistic. In the current period, we find the coexistence of different kinds of racism. We find, for example, chromatism, which is still rife, which is colour racism. We also find old imperial forms of racism as well, against the colonial other. But we also find newer forms of racism. Some have called this cultural racism, other people have called it neo-racism or xeno-racism. But beyond all these different types is what might be called nativism, which I think is the evil twin of nationalism, although nationalism is pretty evil itself, but nativism is even more evil because nativism suggests that some people are the original inhabitants of the land and therefore they should have more legitimate rights to the resources of the land than others, and migrants therefore are intruders in this sphere of the resource claims that they make. And one point that Nicos talks about is migrants being a dangerous surplus population. And I think although it's true, although the tropes of danger, as well as deviance, as well as disgust and desire, the 4 Ds, as I've called them, are central to most forms of racism. The idea that migrants are a surplus population only works at certain times. I don't think that we can call them only surplus populations. They may be in the waiting rooms of being sorted. Some of them are surplus populations and some of them are expellable, expendable, but others are welcomed as and when the economy and the society requires their labour, requires the exploitation that occurs through them. So I think that to call them only surplus populations is to overstress this aspect of the migrants. I think their role as categories of labour at different points in time is important. And I think here I would want to make a distinction also in relation to gender, which is central, because I think with women, it's very difficult to see that women migrants are actually a surplus population, because women migrants actually play a very important role in the process of reproduction of capital and reproduction of the social, because of the care system that migrant women are involved with, the transnational mothering, the care nexus, looking after the old, and making it possible, of course, for women in richer countries to go out to work, and for the equalisation of those women, or the relative equalisation of those women. So I think once you bring a gender dimension into the analysis of migration, it's very difficult to think of them as a surplus population. So I think this is where we might want to make some kind of more nuanced analysis of, the role of migration in the present system. Okay, now I just want to raise some issues for Nicos, which perhaps we'll have some time in the discussion to talk about. One of the points that you make, Nicos, is, of course, to do with the growth of precarity, the importance of precarity. And one of your arguments, the way I understand it, is that more and more precarity leads to more and more struggles. And I want to just take the example of the gig economy and the precariat, if we want to use that term. And one of the things about this category, this newer class category, if you like, is that it lies very uneasily between a kind of euphemistic self-employment on the one hand, and of course super exploitable category on the other hand. And to what extent, and there hasn't been all that much evidence of this group of these kinds of workers actually getting involved in the political sphere so far, because of the nature of their employment, as far as I know. But perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about how greater and greater precarity can lead to more and more forms of organising solidarity struggles. And the other thing that I found very interesting was when you talk about the habitus of precarious migrants, drawing presumably on Pierre Bourdieu's notion of the habitus as a disposition that develops through social location. I mean, one of the problems I have with the notion of habitus is that Bourdieu focuses on dispositions as emanating from social locations as opposed to dispositions evolving out of class relations. So the class relation aspect in Bourdieu is missing. Where the habitus is concerned, you talk about the situated knowledge of migrants in their habitus leading to greater understanding of truth as an analytical principle of knowledge production, which I found very interesting, if I have understood correctly what you're trying to say there. And another point you talk about, because resistance is, I think, the whole notion of resistance, the migrant comments is so central to your book. I want to say, how is resistance generated in everyday life? What are the processes that challenge the habitus or challenge the doxa, the kind of accepted order of things, or the Weltanschauung of a period? What is it about encounters in everyday life? And I know you draw on Althusser's notion of encounter here. How do they facilitate the generation of resistance in everyday life? So I think maybe I've probably said enough for you to deal with. Anyway, just to end, that this is a very rich book with many very key, sort of arguments and important arguments, using a wealth of literature, important literature, making itself a distinct contribution in the way that it theorizes the growth and the potential for new forms of transformatory struggle through the migrant process. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the problems of having the coordinator being also the speaker is, of course, keeping time. So, Nico, can you please make sure that I keep within the limited time that we have, and I will try and be quick and not repeat some of the things that Floya already commented on. I'm actually the odd man out here. In a way, in terms of discipline, I'm not a sociologist. So maybe the way I will approach it, when Nicos invited me, I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yes, I think you will be able to say something about specifically the state of exception, which I have also used in my work." But I found the book very important for a number of reasons that I'm going to explain, and I also have a couple of points that I will like to ask Nicos to tell us more about, and where I think there is a disagreement. It's an important book because it deals with a topical and urgent problem, which is, of course, also a major crisis, migration, the Refugee Dissensus. It's a humanitarian crisis, which we have been experiencing mostly televisually, often rather shockingly, the Mediterranean becoming a liquid necropolis, the dead and the wrecked on the beaches, the images and stories of precarity of people on the move, the fence camps of migrants, and so on. It is also a European crisis in a different sense. The inability of the European Union to effectively deal with the issue. Also a crisis of identity for Europe. Some have seen this, that it kind of strikes directly at what it means to be European hospitality, a crisis over the values that we are supposed to unite upon, the deconstruction of Europe as a normative power, and then the political dissensus that this has created and which Nicos talks about in the book. It's a crisis that precipitates a number of other problems, not least of which is the rise of authoritarian regimes and policies, the securitization of migration, the stigmatization of foreigners and the rise of racism, the proliferation of states of exception in Europe and beyond Europe. All these issues are insightfully and critically addressed by Nicos in this book. And as one would expect of Nicos, it's a theoretical book, but also a polemic. It's a polemic not in the traditional sense, because polemics are sometimes not scholarly documented. But Nicos has produced both a robust theory and a feisty critique of the failures of state and EU action in regard to this, in dealing with this crisis. It displays reflexive understanding of the refugee and migration issue, yet uncompromising in its conclusions and what is to be done. It's both scholarly and also is the fiery and feisty Nicos that we have, we know and love. We know that Nicos never misses an opportunity to be polemic if there is such an opportunity. And this is, of course, a great opportunity, and rightly so. It should be written in a way that also displays the anger and the anxiety that we feel in regard to this issue. Let me give you a flavor. I have a number of extracts from the book that will give you an understanding of also the gist of what the book is about. But I'll be free. I'll be brief in terms of what I won't be free. I'll be brief. This is from the conclusion. It's one of those long sentences that Corina doesn't like when she sees in Nicos. It's 8 or 9 lines, but bear with me. The undignified living conditions of the encamped and many other refugees and migrants outside these camps, the curtailing of access to justice and the right to dignified life and privacy as a result of surveillance by the state, the rising intolerance and hate speech in the everyday life, the traditional and digital public sphere, the increasing levels of inequality and poverty, including child poverty, do not paint Europe in the positive light that older generations of migrants and non-migrants had dreamt of. And of course, that's the way Europe also defines itself. And this is the contradictions that, of course, are fully displayed in current policies. Nicos continues 3 or 4 pages later. One must not lose sight during the crisis and austerity era of the EU. Of course, all this is linked to the financial crisis in the EU. And crisis management concerns were largely about containing the crisis for fear of spreading. The whole notion of creating a guarantee to contain the banking and financial crisis in the Eurozone. And Nicos links this to the way we are trying to contain conflicts and the crisis with regard to refugees. Contagion, Nicos says, however, is another word for the old fear of the domino effect. The failures of containing the problems of a world out of joint are apparent here. He's critical about EU directives in regard to how we as Europeans have tried to contain the conflict and the crisis in a way that will minimize the effect that it will have on European states. And Nicos says, he's critical of scholars who simply see these EU attempts as that they mark a leap forward. And he's basically saying that, if anything, we are today experiencing major setbacks and backtracking, a full-blown regression in the struggle for equality and justice. And this, I think, is a gist of what Nicos's book is about. This is very close to his work and his heart, I think, struggling for social justice and equality. And is someone who, at the same time as presenting a scholarly argument, he's very firm and clear of the ethical commitment that is required and the action that needs to be taken. I think this is a welcome book for raising and dealing with a very important subject in a critical way. I think in terms of scholarly contribution, there are two areas that I think Nicos is really contributing significantly. And this is the two issues that I will also raise some questions. The first one, Nicos says that his approach is a global political sociology approach. This brings him also closer to what I'm interested in. I'm working on international relations and global politics. Nicos has come to global sociology from Immanuel Wallerstein's work. And this is, I'm sure most of you here already know Immanuel Wallerstein, a sociologist, not a typical sociologist, one who has looked at the world system as a unit of analysis that challenged the idea that we need to look at national societies. We need to do sociology also simply within the confines of national societies. He showed how this world system entails structural inequality in terms of core periphery and semi-periphery, that there are serious inequalities in terms of both political, social equality, economic inequality. And this, I have to say, for people, we have here Farid, you may remember when we were doing international relations theory in the 1980s, when we were doing IR theory in 1980s. At that time, there was no interdisciplinarity in international relations, none whatsoever. It was a Cold War discipline, clearly dealing only with questions with interstate affairs. The only one that I remember being used in international relations theory courses was Immanuel Wallerstein. And this is very interesting in terms of the critique that he brought at the time. Well, he was seen as he was the Marxist critique, okay, not the Soviet Marxist, but a very interesting Marxist critique that also talked about the international system in a very different way that the realists and the neo-realists were talking of the international system as a clash of interstate relations and all that. Showing, in other words, the relations that existed in a way that other people who talked about the international society, people like Hedley Bull, etc., were only talking, using sociology, we're talking about the society of states and bringing in some sociology, but not actually challenging the state as the major unit of analysis. This is very important, I think, also for developing a global political sociology, which is, as Nicos says, which is not about displacing or negating national, regional, or local migration or border studies, not to displace the national, but actually a process which is transforming research in ways that combines national territorial specificities and sovereignties with transnational and global studies. And this is what Nicos calls a genuine global political sociology inspired by Wallerstein. I will leave aside questions of authenticity, whether it's a genuine or not, Nico, but what I think is important in what you say is the need to bring the question of the crisis of migration and the plight of refugees in Europe in dialogue with global mobilities and conditions and crises in the global south. I think this is what is very much what you are interested in. I think you talk in your other book as well of the need of developing a multiple south perspective, not to view the south as having one perspective and a new bipolarity between the global south and the global north. So this, I think, is what Nicos' book very much contributes to, a significant achievement. This is where I have questions and I have my own concerns. Global political sociology is a new subfield in international relations. There is even a new journal called International Political Sociology. Very interesting developments in terms of looking at the kind of issues that Nicos is also concerned with. So I think it's important, Nico, for you to tell us how you locate yourself within this kind of developments. Other people also doing global political sociology. And where do you see yourself in relation to these new developments? Just to give you an example that I think you will find especially interesting in terms of the multiple south perspective that you take. I don't think he will call himself a sociologist, Ngugi, but Ngugi's global ethics, how he developed a global ethic approach from Marxian dialectics in order to suggest that it's important to look beyond, we should not simply reproduce the old bipolarities, but look at the globe, any vantage point on the globe as also a starting point for our own reflection. How far your work differs from that, or how far your work also has, I think, is interested in that in a way. So I think it's important to clarify how this affects global sociological approaches, also speak to the work and how you speak back to these other works. The second area that I think Nicos contributes to is critical legal and political theory. And Nicos is, as we know, he studied law, he's an expert on fundamental rights, he engages in advocacy in Cyprus on the basis of that knowledge. But he's not someone he's not simply an advocate, and this is what I personally admire in Nicos, is that he has jurisprudential anxieties at the same time as he does his advocacy. So he doesn't take law as for granted. He knows that the law is there to be revised. He knows the problems that regimes of legal regimes, the state of exception debates, how this has been used. His first book is about the state of exception and the doctrine of necessity in the Cyprus context. The whole idea of how the constitutional order may be suspended, how otherwise democratic regimes are invested with authority to bypass the law. How is that possible? And how is that gray zone between legality and illegality exploited for political purposes? Nicos has started doing this in relation to Cyprus. Now he's trying to do this, look at this globally. This is where he talks about the proliferation of states of exception. And I think this is very important. I haven't seen it done in international relations in the way, at least, that Nicos is doing it. This is where I will, however, this is my own concern, and I will refer to what Floya said about the everyday and about the gaps. And this is something that Nicos points to, that gaps are there, possibilities are there, new solidarities are there. I think, Nico, this is something that perhaps you could have done more, because otherwise we remain with this dark image of the state of exception, this deeply structuralist view that there is no escape. And I think you are showing that this is possible, but I think you don't go you don't travel the full path. And this is what I would personally like to see more coming out of this book. And the other final point that I have in relation to the state of exception, and specifically what you say in the book about the need to confront authoritarian studies, the rise of authoritarian regimes. How do we move beyond the state of exception? This is, if I may dare say, you don't give Trump the attention he deserves. He craves for attention, as we know. Nicos has a short passage on Trumpism, the whole notion, and of course, in relation to migration policies and the anti-migration discourse, scathing anti-migration discourse that comes out of Trump. And very ironic, actually, going to the nativist argument that you are saying, Floya, very interesting that this anti-migration discourse comes from people who are only recent migrants, or 99% of the United States, of course, are migrants in the last 200-300 years. So this is very interesting. But I think what I mean, Nicos, about bypassing, or not bypassing, but quickly dealing with Trump, is that, in my understanding at least, the state of exception that comes out of the United States at this time is not the state of exception that we had during the Bush period. the Bush period, the Guantanamo, what Agamben wrote about, the whole securitization of the dangerous other for the United States through the September 11th and post-September 11th, how this created a notion of abstract enmity which legitimized the state of exception in various ways. I think what we now have in the US is a combination of that and this discourse of greatness and the abstract greatness that Trump goes on about, I think is even more dangerous. Because now it's not only about identifying or pointing to possible terrorists and dealing with them through bypassing international law or finding ways out of the American legal system. Now it's also about people who frustrate the possibility of America to be great. Before it was about people who used violence, who terrorists, in inverted commas, or with or without inverted commas. Now, I think how the whole discourse of greatness creates a different kind of situation. It brings in a new myth about, here I think, talking about myths, I think the work of Ernst Cassirer, for example, is very important vis-a-vis Agamben. Cassirer wrote a very important book at the end of the Second World War. It was published posthumously. It's called The Myth of the State. It's a bit all over the place, partly because it was unfinished. But his main argument was how Nazi authoritarian regimes, the Nazi authoritarian regime was very much based on on the irrationality of myth. The state worked both as a technical, providing technical support, etc. But when there were crises, suddenly this myth of the great nation and of the Jews who were challenging the great nation came forth, arise. And I think this is what we are seeing now too. We are not just seeing the state of exception in the legal sense that Agamben put it. I think we see even more this mythification of the nation, and anything that challenges the greatness of the nation is being vilified, and we have this Agambian state of exception being combined with the kind of exceptionalism of America, the great nation that should become great again, and the only thing that stops it is this possibility, is stopping people not who are using violence, stopping the subaltern from coming to the United States, stopping the powerless, not the powerful, not those who use violence, but those, the poor, those who seek the American dream and all that. I think this is a very dangerous situation, and this is why I think your section on Trump and how we have a proliferation of states of exception, it's important to incorporate how the state of exception is also changing to the extent that Trump is here to stay. And hopefully he will not. But if he does, I think you need to expand that. Thank you.
The difficult and the joyous part about being third is that a lot of the stuff I wanted to say has been already mentioned. So I will try and say something different, avoid some of the repetition, and ask you some questions, Nico. Because when the book arrived, and it arrived quite late, I started thumbing through it and through the pages, and I was faced with a very complex argument that you were developing, and one that is very difficult to express in a few words, but for our sake tonight, I need to risk it. There is a powerful argument in Europe and beyond, I think you are arguing, that there is a transgressive movement of people in the contemporary period that needs control because it threatens a way of life and because its subjects are unassimilable. I mean, the opposite of assimilation. And therefore, states of exception have emerged to specifically expand what existed before in order to deal with these crises. Okay. And you argue instead, if I get you right, that they neither need checking, nor should you be worried about their unassimilability, if I get you right. And you offer us there the concept of dissensus as the way to think through the issue, and you ask us to trust you that disequilibrium is the norm, and the idea of equilibrium, that an equilibrium that needs to be maintained, order needs to be maintained, is basically an ideology of power. Now, the question then becomes, in the face of this human movement that you describe, that attempts to cross borders and seas, in what way, are you saying, can the institutional forms of control and the provision of rights change? What are you telling us? What should exactly change? Does it involve a new form of tolerance? A new moral code? Now, I will try and address that in a few minutes that I'm granted tonight, but I will do it through three lenses: an activist lens, a sociologist lens, and what is asked of all of us these days is a new philosophical lens. In times of crisis, we have to think deep. Activist, so far as I have been involved in struggles against xenophobia or genocide in South Africa or the broader African continent. Sociologist, insofar as analysis is concerned, and thinking about puzzling of how do we embed this as not yet, that which we desire to be actual in our everyday lives. Okay, let's start. Activism. Now, the movement that you described, Nicos, is more harrowing than what your book presents, I think. Yes, as everybody said, we're in a troubled world, but whose pathways and silk roads are filled with people in hazmat suits. These hazardous material suits that people have to wear to deal with pollution, spillages, depleted uranium bombs. 50% of the bombs are with depleted uranium, by the way, if you didn't know. Ebola, and so on. Part of this synthetic material that brings wealth to certain people. And I want to remind you, tell you, that lakeside industries operating from China, from the USA, produces one of the most profitable sides of its enterprise. Hazmat suits, more profitable body bags for bodies, and refugee tents. Okay. The UN says that we have anything from 50 to 29 million people in tents. Now, it's amazing that the UN itself contradicts itself in terms of figures. And we could fill a country like Britain or Vietnam in with them. So, and although people say, but there were prior catastrophes and history is full of them, and look at the Second World War, look at what happened in the Soviet Union, look at what happened in Nagasaki, Hiroshima, look at what happened in Britain, in Germany itself, in terms of how many lives lost, and so on. Is this a catastrophe of that nature, yes or no? It is a catastrophe, I would say. And I insist that the number is exceedingly high. And here's the rub, number. In your debates here, because the consequences that are in debate too many refugees or potential refugees feeds precisely into the right-wing upsurge and its moral panics. Too few seems more politically correct and progressive. Okay, am I wrong in this? In fact, that Nico, you make the point that only 3.84% of the population is foreign. And that is an obvious construction, this panic and fabrication, a perfect storm that destabilizes things. And the discomforting thing is that even if there are not so many, okay, and there are a few, and you're right, the kind of mobilization of hatred, racism and xenophobia is based somehow on observed, rumored, felt and mediated, as in media, realities which are running out of control at the moment. Otherwise, it wouldn't have any traction. It wouldn't mobilize so many people on the right. So something's happening there. So, of course, it is fueled by these human movements, or by the subjects of this human movement, the desire and the integrity to be unassimilable. Their life is a mix of desire and alienation, whether it is informed by a dream of a better life, of social insecurity, violence, and so on, their experiences. But their remaining dignity needs to assert that they're not driftwood or bodies swimming across the Mediterranean. They're not driftwood, and they too come from a long way back, and therefore dignity comes into it there as well. And of course, there are gradations of tolerance about unassimilability, as we all know, because of Europe's Orientalism. The fascination to this day about mystic masseurs, yogis, capoeira and karate masters, sex objects and subjects, something that was attempted to be absorbed by concepts of multiculturalism before in the upper classes that are fading fast as we speak. But also, European thinking is unsure and caught between discourses of human rights, democracy, and culture, at the same time moving against precisely those tenets. So what needs understanding is we have to somehow move from a notion of national human rights to broader global living rights, somehow. The inalienable right to exist, to have a life and a livelihood, the right not to be bombed, the right not to be raped, the right to be used, and so on. But I will return to this later. But it is a serious tension that we are identifying in and through your pages. Okay, sociologist. Now, there is a secret thread through sociology that's become unconscious, become an unconscious, or a cryptocurrency in sociology. Since Talcott Parsons, sociology argues that consensus is the norm. Strip away the sophisticated theories. Okay, integration and adjustment is effective socialization. Exceptions are deviant, and there are social problems. Okay, there is society, and people must cope. There are psychologists. There are all kinds of disciplines to help you cope. And foreigners must learn the language, must speak it beautifully, must whiten their skin, must kiss the icons. Europe has norms. So you're trying to break away from that in your book. And through your critique of these states of exception around that, we are faced with the fact that we have to wipe out a lot of sociology if we're going to arrive at the global sociology you are asking us for. And there is no escape from this to our friends Althusser and Laclau, which also trap you in their Parsonian snare. What is interpellation? I call you something and you are it. Okay, I call you useless black and you are it. I call you this and you are it. It is creating these categories that allow power to operate and society to integrate and reproduce itself. And Rancière there, your usage of Rancière and dissensus, and your use of disequilibrium and power is such an attempt to break with this tradition. And for that, I salute you, because this tradition has taken us nowhere. But what I need to ask you is that your concept of dissensus, okay, which is such, I'd buy the book if I didn't even know you. When I see that title, wow, let's go for it. The way you work the Rancière, I want to ask, is it a generative or a descriptive concept? If it is generative, in which way does it explicate things and necessary change? Okay, so I'm asking you to demonstrate that it explicates dynamics and how it may transform X, Y, Z, and so on, laws, rules, norms, and around human rights. So, or is it descriptive? It's just a topology, okay, these things are dissensus, and we move on. I think you're trying to argue the former, but sometimes it slips into the latter. And then what is needed, you mentioning it all the time, and it doesn't have its, after your account of Lesbos and Moria, I would have pleaded for a sociology of encampment. A sociology of what happens in camps and what kind of identities, what kind of belongings, what kind of homelands are imagined, and so on in all these encampments. Because we know from Rwanda, Congo, and so on, these are the recruiting grounds for further struggles and further movements that are being exploited by all kinds of powers that be in interesting ways. But encampment of this kind is a peculiar thing. It is a peculiar. It's humanism's gulags, aren't they? It is precisely our humanitarian point through the United Nations that we have to do something about the refugee issue, but to do so we have to sift them out, put them in camps, and like in the DRC, they could be waiting for 20 years there. It's a whole lifetime. So a bit more sociology of encampment in order to do away with camps might have been fantastic. And now, the more philosophical issue. How do we deal with this? I understand the European conundrum and the confusion of whether exclusion operates on the basis of Gemeinschaft, as they say in sociology, or Gesellschaft. In other words, is it a violation of our community, our history of civilization, or the norms in the household, and so on? Granny was here baking bread, and all these people, these strange people are around. Or is it they're undemocratic, they don't believe in human rights, they are this, they are that? Which one is it? Is it both? How do they operate? You read texts and they shift from the one to the other all the time. Is Europe anything more than an imperial club these days? Or is it Christian? Is it, what is that thing that defines the other at the moment without it being other for others? So philosophically, it gets into trouble. And our friend Homi Bhabha recently, whom I don't understand most of the time, finally hit it on the head, I think, for me. Based on the necropolis that he was watching there in Morocco, when he was in Morocco, all those bodies strewn on the beach, trying to cross. And he argued that we need a new philosophy in dealing and transforming the world. And he called it the future conditional. And what he argued is that it's not them, it's not other. They are us, possibly tomorrow. We are they. Look at them. We are they. In this world of uncertainty, it's not us and them. We are they in potentio in contemporary times. which has a long history in literature. But nevertheless, it made me think, because how do we make those who are non-us, however we define us, excludable? How do we make them, non-excludable? How do we make these Syrians, these Afghans, these Iraqis, these Pakistanis, and so on, like the Vietnamese before, like all these human migrations coming out of violence? How can we philosophically and morally create a code that makes them non-excludable under any condition? And searching with you through the book, through Arendt, Balibar, Fekete, Frankenberg, Foucault, Hall, Poulantzas, he left Marx out, I agree, but Thompson, Wallerstein, just so many thinkers, just thinking with you through this, is still an open question. What you call the justice cascade can't be just about bringing immigration policy under the rule of democratic law. Has to be something deeper underpinning that law. And then, shouldn't we also, and I agree here with what was said before, be reflecting on Agamben's bare life, properly, not in his way, properly to understand that it is never a bare life, that once it's reduced to bare life, those people are dead. Finished. There's always resistance, micro-resistances, and ways of creating new forms of life out of miserable, horrid conditions. And it reminds me, just things that we heard here in Cyprus when we were trying to find out what has happened during the war and during all these troubles. And this expression by people, couldn't kill, my plasmatare, this sense, deep kind of folk induced kind of morality that needs to be expanded somehow if we're going to do anything out of it. And then finally, my question is around resistance. I understand resistance of the old sense. I withdraw my labor, the boss comes smacking me in the face, I still withdraw my labor, I might get more, I strike, I mobilize, I boycott, and so on. It's always about resistance in big institutions is about withholding something, the only thing you have, in order to create conditions for change. But when we're talking about these forms of precarity, migrants, refugees, and so on, it is politics of, I hate the word encroachment, isn't it? It's just about getting access, moving things, getting more access, more pavement, more this, more that. And how does that link up into any broader resistance at national, international level? You say it should happen, but please, can you explicate how? So in conclusion, I would say, thank you for the challenge. The work needs a volume 2. It needs a way through which you can really extend the argument and beyond the European dilemma, although most of it is around the European dilemma at the moment, as it stands, although your claims are much more global. And I think that anybody who reads the book will be angered, will be supportive, but any good work shatters complacency. Thank you for that.
I like Costas because he only gave me 10 minutes. He was supposed to speak for 15 and he spoke for half an hour. Thank you, Costas. And thank you for this. This is, I'm very greatly honored and humbled about this, about your comments. And I feel unable to properly reflect and thank you enough for bringing all of this out, all three presentations. I think that when I was reflecting, I was trying to anticipate what you three were going to say today in order to prepare for this. And I wasn't sure. I thought they were going to speak about this. Costas mentioned something about speaking about Trump. I said, that would be easy. Trump, come on. Floya, we had a discussion, but had no presentation before, no indication, no indication where things would go. And Ari mentioned a few things which I wasn't sure what he was going to go about. So now I have to kind of think ahead. And I think I'm going to give you a very weak response because I think all the challenges you put forward here are immense. The first thing I want to say is that only last night when I was browsing, I got a message that our Minister of Interior here had warned that we should be expecting more than 100,000 refugees coming to Cyprus, and this is going to be a major, major crisis coming ahead. And this is just the latest of what is going on in terms of the issue being central. At the beginning, I thought that if I was going to write a book again, how would I do it? Well, first of all, I would try and respond to all your questions. So perhaps I wouldn't have written it the way I did in terms of what I had to say. And this is not to deny what I said in this book. I think I would have changed. I wouldn't change my mind on the basis. I think I'm more confident of the basic thesis of the book today than I was when I was writing it. The world is going in this direction in a very, very, very negative way, in a very disturbing way for all countries, much bigger than what I had imagined when I started working on this field. And this is not just the final stages of the book. When I started working in this field some years ago. But I think I would have done it differently. First of all, I will make it simpler, hopefully not raise the kind of complex questions that I've raised today. And two, to make it much more accessible, because I think one of the difficulties in dealing with issues like migration is precisely how complex it is, because it really destroys our very understanding of what society is about. What is society? Migration questions the very order of what society is about. And this is extremely, extremely complex and difficult to grasp. Never mind trying to think ahead. And I think I would have try and address some of the key things. Now, let me respond. Costa, how long do I have? 5 minutes. Let me start with Floya. Floya has raised some of the key concerns. I have grappled with this idea of the surplus population, and this is directly taken from Marx's Capital. This is like the surplus population. I reread. Actually, I read the new translation, the new available translation of what surplus population was about. And I read it very, very closely again, because I thought it should be reread today in the light of what is going on today. And I think the notion of the relative surplus population is extremely fruitful, because what has gone in the public discourse today, for many, many years before, was the other kind of category that Marx has used when he's talked about the reserve army of labor. I think the reserve army of labor is a very problematic concept. But the surplus population gives you a different picture. Now, I'm not saying this applies, and I agree with Floya. I'm not saying that this applies to all migrants. I mean, come on, Thodoris is here, who's looking at some people who are very, very much welcome here. He's working on passports and the selling of passports. And if we look across, we see some of the owners of these passports owning also some of the flats around here. So we're talking about a very, very different category, opening the doors of democracy, in fact, undermining democracy by giving people passports who have never set their foot here and are probably want to come in this country only wants to pick up their passport and disappear, okay, and probably sell there. So there is a big, big question there. And I think the question of gender and what surplus population is an extremely important one in terms of care regimes, in terms of reproduction, and in terms of how we can understand the very notion of how society is organized. And I have tried to play in this chapter, and I think it's undeveloped, and it's only the beginning of an argument, of this basic idea that the notion of surplus, which is connected to the notion, it's connected to the notion of the excess. It's surplus because it produces profit, not just profit in the economic sense, but profit in the political and the social sense, as well as the notion of excess. The excess being a potential, but also which produces danger, but also proposes an openings. And here, it's something we really need to think. And I think we can think through gender, and I'm urging others to think of how gender could be used, how be read to rethink the notion of surplus populations and excess. Now, Floya, I'm not sure I would dismiss it as a way of arguing against it. I would say that what we need is your second tier of argument, which is basically we need a more nuanced approach of what a surplus population is about. So I think gender allows this opening to happen. On the question of precarity, actually I must say that I had written a chapter, long chapter, on labor and precarity, which I had to leave out of this book. So I hope, Ari, that volume 2 will include precarity as a key. And in fact, I am looking at the gig economy and how this is actually transforming ideas about digitalities, and how resistance in the digital situation is coming through. The interesting thing about the whole debate on the gig economy and digitalities is that in terms of how it should be regulated in law and how it should be understood, is that when lawyers, and I'm looking at one of the best books I've written on the subject he's saying because law doesn't understand this, we have to look at sociologists. So the first 2 chapters are a review of what sociologists are saying about the gig economy and about how digitality is transforming the very technological understanding of the world in order to begin to think about how to regulate these matters. So I think we have a big opening here. Law is looking at sociology as an opening, and I think it's a victory of law over sociology. By the way, I'm also a lawyer apart from a sociologist. So I think that there is here a big thing, and I want to say that there are inscriptions of potential struggles in these areas, but they have to be recodified and understood in ways that make connections in a very different way. I don't have time to develop this now, but I have written, and I urge you to look at the next book, hopefully. Resistance and habitus. I agree with you. I think that there is an issue, there is a difficulty here in how Bourdieu is doing this, and I think resistance is the key, and how resistance is generated through this. And this connects to Ari's issue of what is it about, and how does this generate the kind of resistance today in the context of the world that we're talking about. And this is not a theoretical issue only. It's primarily a political issue, primarily a social question that we're living through today. I think it's theoretical in different ways on how we theorize it, but primarily the conundrum and the dead end we're at now is essentially a political dead end. And we must begin to think of the world in a different way. And Costa, yes, this is a polemic, and it's a theoretical polemic as it is an injunction of what is going on, but it is primarily a concern and a call, an urgent call that academia is not only about sitting around and theorizing. It's about engagement and it's about commitment. Otherwise, it makes no sense in this world. It makes no sense, and I cannot think of myself as an academic if I wasn't engaged and committed to causes that would change the world, to make it more livable, to make it more dignified. So I think this is really a fundamental call that I see no difference. I see no conflict between the two. This is what I try to do in this book. But there are important moments, theoretical aspects that we need to look into this. And I agree that this notion of, and I've tried to develop this very, very briefly. It's the beginning, at the end of the book, where I try to think in terms of the notion of crisis as which for those in order, the question there is, how do I contain it? How do I manage the crisis? As a way of rethinking the order of things, because it inevitably forces us to rethink the order of things. It doesn't stop there. As for Trump, you're right. In fact, I said, why should it be? I thought that Trump was a digression. I think Trump is a digression. Fundamentally, that's what it is. It really is something. Can I take somebody seriously who tweets one thing in the morning and tweets something in the afternoon and then tweets something very different, and it's full of rubbish of what he says? Unfortunately, Trump is a new paradigm of governance. As a new paradigm, and he's a manifestation of a new paradigm. It's not Trump. It's a manifestation, because it's not just Trump. It's look at what's going on in India. Look what's going on in many European countries. Look at what's going on in Brazil. It's a big major country. So it's not. Look at what's going on in Turkey with Erdogan. Hopefully one thing that's good, positive. Netanyahu is gone. So that's a glimmer of hope that something is finished politically. What I'm trying to say here is that we are called upon as social scientists and as political scientists and as intellectuals and as activists to take seriously things that are happening around us, which perhaps we wouldn't have even thought about taking up. And Trumpism is one. And as for the states of exception, I agree with you that it is a way of thinking that I try to overcome. I don't know if I have succeeded. I thought that what I have tried to do is say thinking in terms of the states of exception is accepting, Ari, the logic of order. It's accepting the logic of how those in position of power try to think of others. But we have to start from there. If we're going to resist power, we need to say, how are those in power viewing us and viewing the world? And it's an important point to start off. But we have to stop there and we have to think of how this is going to happen. The questioning it comes at the time where in practice there is a proliferation of states of exception in different shapes and forms. And how so the sociology of encampment that Ari has been speaking about. Yes, you're right. I should have written a whole new chapter or a book on the sociology of encampments today. But I can't do this alone. There are so many others who have to take up these tasks. I can think of different ways of how this is going to happen. As for the question of, I think this connects the question of nativism, and I think the question of nativism is very important. Floya mentioned, Ari mentioned, I think Costas also mentioned this question of nativism. It's so strange that the countries which have obliterated and destroyed and make people vanish, the first peoples, are speaking in nativist language. Look at the United States. It's amazing how this is. It really makes me angry just to think about it. But this calls on us to take the nativism seriously. take the politics of nativism seriously in terms of theorizing and showing how this is actually happening here. That nativism is based on denialism, on the fact that they have exterminated the first peoples in the first place. So I think this is a major challenge we have to think about. Ari, you are right in raising these questions, and I think both you and Floga are trying to help us think on whether we can think of, not as activists and as sociologists, the idea of order. And I try to do this via the use the term of dissensus. Dissensus is maybe not well known in non-academic circles, but I think that it is a very, very valuable way of thinking of things. It's valuable because it opens up spaces to think of a world where there is not just fundamental disagreement between people, but there's disagreement over what we disagree about. It's a disjointed reality that opens up spaces and dynamic. So on the one hand, yes, it is descriptive. It describes a reality. On the other hand, it explicates and it opens up possibilities of rethinking the world. Now, I'm not sure whether the world will change. Well, I am sure that the world cannot change just through ideas. Many times what we are describing as social scientists is basically taking up things that are happening outside and trying to put them in some sort of order and give some ways out. It's not going to come through the thinking or the kind of philosophical ways of thinking, but it does help if we can begin to see things differently. And if we begin to see things differently, and through those lenses, we can provide for alternatives, we can provide for ideas, then this can be a major force for change. And I think in the limited capacity we have as academics of influencing the world, this is really something. And I hope that in this book I have said something interesting, said something useful, and for others to take it off from me. I'm humbled and honored for your presence and for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico. We open up the floor for questions. Harry?
Thank you very much. I have not seen the book, so I do apologize in advance if what I say is somewhat off. But having heard the reviewers and the critique, I might just raise a few points. It seems to me that you are critiquing the world that deals with migrants in a terrible way. But as I think the last speaker faced it, I'm not sure who you are blaming. Are you blaming the states? Are you blaming the culture, the people? Are you blaming the individual? And it seemed oddly, as an international relations, that you believe in the power of the people, but you constantly blame the state. So you believe the state is responsible for all the misery. And in the last argument, you said the United States. That's an extremely realist view, which is the right conservative view in international relations. Whereas, if you look at Europe, can you not see political culture? Culture of the people that pushes governments to take such quote-unquote racist policies. The other point, I think that's the most fundamental point I wanted to raise, but the discourse of greatness, Costa, you said, but hegemonic stability, isn't it the same thing in a way? I mean, discourse of greatness. In the sense that, in one sense, the difference is that now Trump is putting nationalism above capitalism, which is for the first time. Up to now, China gave more profit, so investment in China was good. But now, because it hurts American nationalism, is not good. So, in that sense, it's a weakening of that globalization strengthening of nationalism now, whether we think that's good or bad. Question about political sociology. Can I just borrow from Marx? Is there a sociology which is not political? I mean, when we talk about political economy, Marx, of course, disagreed with that quite openly, that he believed every economy is political. So, is there really a sociology that is non-political, and therefore we say political sociology? My very last point, if I may, is the beautiful thing that the last speaker mentioned on question of we and they. And I wanted to link it to something that is close to me. I like their mysticism, that the world is a mirror of us and everybody else. And we see in them what we project into them. And the bits that we don't like, we detest, and we call the other. And the bits that perhaps we like is us. That, for me, resonated, mysticism, and I wanted to mention that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'll take a few questions and then get Nicos to respond. Anyone else?
I think we might like to connect the question of nativism to patriarchal heteronormativity in order to begin to dismantle it somehow. And the second point I wanted to raise has to do with what Farid just mentioned about what we don't recognize in others, what we dislike in us, because we sort of recognize it in others. But there's also another parallel discourse where we love the other precisely because it opens up fields of desire. And desire can be a powerful force. Also responding to Ari's comments about Homi Bhabha's approach, I'm a little bit concerned. I'm not so sure that Bhabha's theorizing in that particular incident would be particularly helpful. And I remember one day I was on the bus here in Nicosia, and there was a discussion about xeni, and then I dared make a slight intervention, and I said, but we've also gone abroad to seek jobs. That woman responded straight away. We were decent, honest people. We went abroad to make a living. These are fees. And that floored me. And I think that there is a certain vested interest in maintaining this privilege of us over those who are drowned on the beach. We might even like, in a certain demonic way, I mean, this is completely horrifying, but we might even like that because it makes us so different. Oh, look at that, oh man, what if also means anyone there? But I agree, though, that we could be there tomorrow because we never know.
Thank you, Stavro. Shall we give the floor to Corina?
My biggest critic.
Corina.
On Trumpism, because I think that is a very interesting argument. Is it correct to say that we are rid of Salvini, we are rid of Netanyahu, hopefully next year we will be rid of Trump, and that their legacy does not linger on in a kind of morality that is applied across the board, especially if we're talking about significant states like Israel and the US. I mean, Salvini already has an admirer in Cyprus, and he's the Minister of the Interior. And we don't know what he would have been like if there had been somebody else in Salvini's shoes in Italy to give a different paradigm of migration management. So is it really an issue of getting rid of one politician, or handling the legacy that these people have left behind in terms of politics?
Well, I enjoyed the discussion immensely, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. But I mean, my contribution will be just for you, autoethnographic, if you will. But it is a question And it's about, I'd like to hear more about the socio-cultural register of receiving migrants. Because as kind of an elite migrant myself, in the sense that, you know, I work abroad in Norway, but I have like a stable job and stuff. And yet, this particular context of Norwegian, Scandinavian, Aryan context in many ways, this is the first time in my life where I'm not registered as white. So the social cultural kind of context is hugely significant. This would never fly in the UK. This would never fly in Cyprus, obviously. But within Norway, a person from Southern Europe, what the Americans call olive skin or whatever, is registered as non-white. And it has happened to me, you know, recurringly. So if, you know, in your next version of the book, please...
Hopefully cheaper paper. Yes. Mike.
Sorry, I came a little bit late. I just heard this term Trumpism, which does concern me a lot because it reminds me a lot of Thatcherism in a way. Thatcherism was a kind of extension of Trump. Kind of Trumpism hasn't just landed, you know, and suddenly there's a whole new ideology and we've got to understand it. It's a continuation of something. And a lot of the things that Trump says, Enoch Powell was saying in the 1960s in England. So I think it needs to be understood differently. Just because he tweets and Obama was using Facebook, you know, that's his obsession with his very narcissistic person. You know, he's obsessed with himself. And I think Trump's got to be seen also as in terms of his media context. And his mother played a very big role in him becoming president. He's a very wealthy man and became president. But to actually sort of like develop this whole new theory about Trumpism, there's people in America who've been saying the things he's been saying for a long time. And they're in the Ku Klux Klan, some of them, you know. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about this new definition of something that is just a regurgitation. You know, much in the same way that Boris Johnson says, let's make Britain great again. And Trump says, let's make America great again. And someone in Europe says the same thing about their country. There's something very nationalistic about all this. I think, you know, it's important that we see it as a sort of a resurgence towards a real more extreme form of nationalism.
Okay. Final one?
My question is a little bit practical because I'm also a lawyer trying to understand sociology. In your book, because of course I haven't decided, do you speak about regular and irregular migration? And if yes, do you offer any practical solutions concerning irregular, mainly migration and refugees? Thank you very much.
Well, maybe I'll say a couple of things. One of the things is the connection between people's own understandings and articulations of nationalism, racism, exclusion, bordering, and the ordering and sorting that takes place at the level of governmentality and biopolitics, and at the level, something that I wanted to hear more about is the role of capital and the interests of capital, and how capital, the interests of capital link up to the interests of the state and in relation to migration, because we can spend too long on talking about, you know, the political without reference to issue of resources, and the issue of allocation and distribution of resources, and the attempt to sort of exclude from resources. It's a central aspect, I think, not just of capitalism, but of nationalism. Struggles around nationalism very often struggles around resources, and they're sort of struggles between exclusion and usurpation. Some people who want to come in and take over the resources and the retrenchment. But the issue of the connection between those two levels, and some people argue that, you know, for example, in regard to racism, there's the vernacular, everyday racism on the one hand, and there's the state and institutionalized and structural racism on the other. And I think that we have to look at this in time as a dynamic process, because I don't think that you can rely on either one or the other as a mode of explanation, because I think that you know, social processes and sort of cultural understandings and the development of ways of thinking take place in a historicized way, and you know, you don't just look at a still shot. And because of that, I think it's important to look at that articulation between those two levels. But I think what mediates the articulation of those two levels is the issue of playing to unequal access to resources. I think you know, that in both the vernacular or the everyday sense and in the more ordering sense, what is being articulated there is fear of losing resources, fear of lack of security, you know, in the case of the vernacular, the everyday, you know, people's own sense of lack of safety and insecurity and dispossession. And this is used very much by populist parties. They play on those fears. And I don't think it's just a politics of fear, by the way, that Ruth Wodak talks about. I think it's a politics of resource struggles and how those manifest themselves in this way.
Okay. I just respond very briefly to the comment about Trump, and then let Nicos tell us his final thoughts. Mike, Trumpism, it's a term that is being used, but also something that Nicos uses in the book. So that's how it came in the discussion. And I think what Corina says is very important in terms of the legacy of Trumpism, not Trump as a great ideologue or theorist. I agree very much on the idea of narcissism and how this comes out of very much is part of the political discourse of Trump. But I think it's also a characteristic of a shift with regard to how the state of exception, to the extent that it will become, to the extent that it's used in the American context and maybe in the European context, if nationalist parties, if far-right groups take over, it plays very much on this idea. What Trump does, it links state of exception with American exceptionalism. It's a bit different. I don't know whether you know the term of American exceptionalism, that the United States is very different than all the other nations because it's European but developed very differently than the so-called all Europe of imperialism, etc. Therefore, it's a great nation, it's a new nation, it's about freedom, it's about liberty, and all that is linked now with Trump. The whole idea of greatness, that's where it becomes more dangerous. The idea of the nation, that the nation has a destiny to fulfill. You know, not just dangers in the world, which is what Bush was played about. American exceptionalism was always there, but with Trump, it becomes even more important. The notion that whoever endangers our greatness or might undermine the greatness that we have needs to be dealt with. And this is where the subaltern, the migrants, suddenly become the target in a way that they were not the target under Bush. in American, in the Trumpist version. But also, and this links to what Farid was saying, I think it's also very different, the way it's played out, Farid. I don't think it has to do anything with hegemonic stability. Why? Look at what happened in northern Syria. You know, a traditional notion of how, a realist notion of how the United States should function is that, well, we need to retain the hegemony that we had in northern Syria. He's ready to sacrifice it because the Kurds didn't help us in Normandy. You know, all these strange reasons. This is not our job. So let them fight their fights. It's all linked back to the idea that in order to be great, we should not spend too much effort in all these battles. We kill al-Baghdadi, but we don't actually...
Something fundamentally wrong with what you just said, though, because they kept the oil. Right? The Americans are keeping the oil in Syria. That's where hegemony comes in.
Mike, you may be right about that, but in the good old days of the Cold War, it was retaining also territorial control of having forces on the side, which would be your patron, your clients. Suddenly, all these have been handed over to Russia. What this makes of the old balance of power, and I'm referring to the hegemonic stability, that the hegemon should be the United States. Suddenly, the United States is fine with handing over the hegemony, at least of northern Syria. Maybe it kept the oil, maybe it wouldn't. We will see in due course. But this is what I find very interesting in terms of how American exceptionalism is being used through this narcissistic discourse of that comes out of Trump. But Nicos can inform us.
Just my final words here. I think that what the question Farid raises, who's to blame?
I'm not sure who's to blame. The question is not who's to blame. The question is, what do we do about it? The question is, how do we understand what is going on with all this, the collusion? If you look at what goes on in Moria, okay, just one example of that I empirically looked at what goes on there. And I tried to say, okay, who is responsible? Who has the power to do things? If you look at the kind of collusion that is going on here between the different forces maintained for different reasons, the reality is that we have a major crisis and encampment situation, and the different forces of order are keeping things as they are. So the order of things is this. There are those who are resisting, and my argument is that I'm definitely not blaming the people, because I think those who are trying to use the people, they're trying to use it in a different way. Now, there is a short chapter. Ari asked me, what are you trying to do in this chapter? You know, maybe you should be thinking about removing it. It's chapter 6. It's on insecurity, immigration, class, and democratization. So the question Floya asked earlier on about the relationship between capital and articulation and populism is beginning. I tried to keep it there and kind of reorder it, because I think this is a beginning of a debate that is beginning to take shape, but it has not been properly thought of. So it's not fully developed, but I think it's a frame of trying to think of all these populists raising the question, whose interests are they claiming, and how is the different factions of capital responding to this? And I think this relates to what Corina's question is about. Because Corina's question is, I think, is twofold. What is the legacy of people like Trump? And also, what are the underlying forces that generate new Trumps around the world? So Trumpism, I'll agree with you, Mike, it's not just this is not something deep about it, but there is something deeper beyond the individual. I remember the old debates about Stalin, yes, some time ago. It's not just about one individual. It's about the kind of underlying forces that keep on generating this. And I think there is a fundamental question, and that's why I think we should be taking this more seriously, and that's why there is a paradigm shift. Ori, I think you are right to raise this question, but this goes to show on how serious, how this, in the current state of flux,
we're becoming black. We're becoming darker in different contexts. And many, many years ago, when I was speaking in Sweden, actually, at a meeting next to an American lawyer, a black American lawyer, and I said when I asked to sign what I am, and I had to tick the different boxes, I used to tick black other, and he looked at me with disgust, and he said, "Black other, come and we take a walk together in LA and see who's black and white. What are you talking about, man?" That's what he told me. And I thought, oh, okay. So in a different context, this is changing. And I think this relates to what Ari was saying about Homi Bhabha. Actually, Stavro, I think Homi Bhabha's point is interesting because, Theory, we are they. Thank you.